Do you think keeping track of the family history is important? And do you think we should try to pay attention? And is there anything to learn from?
I know it's important to me, and to know how I am tied to the rest of the world. And I'm always looking for my root, because I was sort of yanked and placed here. And constantly I'm looking for my Chinese root. Like, you ask me a lot of cultural questions, and I am looking for those cultural answers as well.
I'm sitting here with my grandmother, and could you actually please state your name, your birth name, and your Chinese name?
And my Chinese name too. My birth name is Lo Fen. Lo is a family name, and Fen, or Lo Yu Wen, my given name. And since coming to the United States, I'm Yvan Lo. And since I'm married, I'm Yvan Hoehn-Saric.
Could you please state your name and where you were from?
Rudolf Hoehn-Saric, originally from Graz, Austria.
I'm from Suzhou, which is about 30 miles southwest of Shanghai. And it's a very ancient city, has a documented history of more than 2,000 years. And it's known for many things. It's known for its artistic history. We produce many artists, poets, and it's still famous for its gardens. When people go to China nowadays, they go to see the gardens there. It's a very beautiful old city. And the whole area is extremely fertile. It's in the Yangtze Valley, and it's known for its rice and fish and silk industry.
Well, Radensi or Radain, depends how you are calling it, was a spa which was in our family for 5 generations. It was both spa and also some mineral wells which were then bottled and distributed. Around Radensi there was very little except the spa itself. There was no large town, there was not very much going on and so on. So we were really in the center of it, and anything which was going on in the spa. And for us children to grow up, it was a very privileged growing up. As a matter of fact, my parents were always kind of worried that we would be kind of grown up to kind of too spoiled. And for instance, my father insisted that we brush our own shoes and so on. So what I did is I would put my dirty shoes under the bed and put some clean shoes on, and the maid would pick up the dirty shoes and clean them and put them back again.
It was a very difficult time. I was born in 1936, and in the midst of Japanese invasion, Japan had started invading China from the north. So, and it was coming slowly down south, and we were more in the middle of China. And there was very active battling in Shanghai, and it was coming toward Suzhou. So we left, and we were refugees staying a few steps ahead of the Japanese invaders. And my father was a professor at Suzhou University, and because of the critically violent situation, the whole university moved the teachers with groups of students. And literally they were running to stay ahead of the Japanese soldiers. And wherever it was safe and could stay for a while, they would stop and then held classes. And so they traveled around in the southern part, and after probably a couple of years in a circuitous route, they were able to resettle in Shanghai.
My father was a physician, and my parents married around 1924 and so on. But he died in a motorcycle accident when I was 3 years old, and so on. My mother then developed TB and had to go to Davos in Switzerland for a cure. And before going there, she met Dr. Hoehn-Saric, who became then my stepfather and adopted me. Therefore, we have the double name, Hoehn from an actual biological father, and Saric from the adopted one.
My parents didn't meet as you would think of meeting, because their marriage was arranged. And when young people come of certain age in the family thinking about looking for an appropriate husband or wife. And my mother's father was teaching my father and was very impressed with my father's intelligence, character. So, and that's how the marriage was arranged. And apparently my mother was, several people approached the family, want her hand. And one was from a very wealthy family, owned a lot of silk factories and what have you. But my mother's father chose my father because of his intelligence and character and willingness to work hard, and what a good person he was.
My grandfather was an entrepreneur and a very successful businessman. And my mother is somewhat after him. She always enjoyed business. When she was after high school, she wanted to go to medical school, but then my grandfather got sick and so on, that she had to help my grandfather in business, and then when my grandfather died, so she became very much involved in the business and so on. Fortunately, later on, my stepfather was a very good businessman too, so the two were able to divide the work amongst them, but she was always very much involved.
Growing up, there were two things that really influenced my father. One was his father died before he was born. Then his mother died soon after he was born. And then he was raised by a relative who soon became a widow herself. So he was raised by a single mother with a lot of family support and all that. Been an only child, so I understand he was very spoiled. He got everything he wanted. But on the other hand, like with most Chinese families, there were very high expectations in terms of being a good person. The high expectations, being a humane, moral person, and educated. I should say a few words about the Chinese history of that time. China had been an empire for 2,000 years, and China became a republic in 1911. In the years before that, the country was extremely chaotic. There were revolutions. The government was trying to change some political, social changes, And through the time of the empire, the population made advances in life by being educated and taking imperial examinations to enter into civil service. There were civil examinations. So it was an encouragement for everybody to study. Theoretically, even if you're a child of if you're a cowherd or if you were a farmer's helper, so if you studied, you could become something very high in the government. You can be prime minister. And there are always stories of these exceptional people. So studying was the thing. But as the time during, in 1911, the time of the Republic, an entire change politically, socially, educationally. That was the thing, because the Chinese knew we had to advance in order to advance in the world, you have to learn science and technology.
So the other place where we were, actually where I went to school and we stayed most of the time, was Zagreb, which is now the capital of Croatia. At that time, Yugoslavia consisted out of several large states. There was a Serbia, there was a Croatia, and there was Slovenia. And the Croatians were always close to the Austrians in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and many Croatians served in the Austro-Hungarian army, like my uncle Marci, who then became Field Marshal Lieutenant, which is the second highest rank in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and who was frequently invited to lunch by the emperor. He was given nobility. So, I mean, there was a strong kind of positive feeling, not towards the later Germany, but towards the old Austro-Hungarian kind of monarchy. And on the other hand, the Serbs always were enemies of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and they kind of indirectly provoked the First World War by assassinating the crown prince and so on. And they are Greek Orthodox. They were always more oriented towards in old time Byzantium and later on towards Russia and so on.
And there were some very roaring battles in Shanghai. And of course, Nanjing, the tragedy in Nanjing is, unforgettable. Hundreds of thousands of people died within a few days. And so the Japanese were everywhere. And of course, one remembers what the Nazis did, but very few people talk about the Japanese concentration camps and what kind of horrible things they use, human experiments and all that. So, and we were obviously terrified. So Shanghai was occupied by Japanese, and the Americans were protecting, so they were bombing. We were bombed by the Americans from the top. And when things calmed down a bit, my father had the opportunity of coming to the United States in 1941, just before Pearl Harbor. He came to study in America, first in Virginia, where he got the master's degree in physics at Virginia Tech. Then he came to Baltimore and studied at Johns Hopkins University, where he got the PhD degree in physics, but he couldn't go home.
On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
I had an older brother. He was 2 years older than I was. He was, in contrast to, actually we were quite different in many ways. He was always very neat. He was talented in languages and absolutely not talented in mathematics. I was usually the more the grubby one. I didn't like new clothes, I liked old clothes and so on. Because he was always so fastidious, they called him the Count and they called me the peasant. And contrary to him, I am not talented in languages, but I was always good in mathematics.
Yeah.
But he was a very nice, kind of a fairly quiet, nice person.
As I mentioned, my father came to the States and my mother stayed in Shanghai with 3 of us at the time. I had one older brother, and one older brother is 3 years older than I, and my younger brother Eddie is 3 years younger than I. And so we stayed in Shanghai and waiting for my father to come home.
The Germans came into Yugoslavia. They started out by bombing, without the declaration of war, they just started to bomb Beograd and so on. And there was everything went topsy-turvy and so on. People did not know what was going on. And we were in Zagreb, and because Zagreb was a larger town, so it was more exposed to war, we wanted to get back to Radense. We found somebody who agreed to drive us about half of the way, and so on. And the car of this man was stolen kind of the day before, but he saw the car somewhere on the street and he had the second set of keys, so he just went there, you know, and drove off and so on. So he drove us to one place in Slovenia where we also had some possession to stay overnight. And next day, when he was kind of fixing the car, he lifted the back seat and found under the back seat a box of 50 hand grenades. We were driving all night long on this box with hand grenades.
Thinking back, it must have been very hard for my mother. I have to tell you, as I mentioned, we were not religious, but during the war, my mother became religious. She would go to church and go to prayer meetings because of all that's going on, and I think religion gave her some sense of security or something she could pray for.
Well, people had, in Yugoslavia, where people had very mixed feeling. They were admiring the German prosperity, the organization, the effectiveness of the whole economy, or the building of roads and so on. The various laborers got very good fringes and so on. So it was very positive in this way. At the same time, they thought that the Germans were cold, distant, dangerous, and so on. So it was a mixed feeling. In contrast, for instance, people in Yugoslavia much more preferred the French, because when statesmen were invited to France, They were wined and dined, provided with some mistresses and so on. They had a good time. Whereby when they went to Germany, they would see a military parade.
Colder.
They would see kind of efficient factories and so on.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of a very mixed feeling.
I know one night we watched an American airplane fell and exploded not too far from our house. And then there were bomb shelters. If you were outside, you could go into a bomb shelter. And since we only had our my mother was very important to us. As long as she was around, we always felt safe. But there were times when she would go out somewhere and not come home, and it would be getting dark or be raining outside, and then we would all look out the window waiting for my mother to come home. But is that a direct result of the war? Or so it's that kind of anxiety, but it wasn't intolerable. We were all in it. Everybody was in it.
You know, the war was going on for some years, and it was kind of a ruthless partisan war. You know, the German would execute sometimes. If a German soldier was killed somewhere, they would just round up people, first 10 people, later on even 50 people and so on, randomly almost, you know, and shot them and so on. So there was these atrocities were going on all the time. One time the partisans blew up the railroad going from Zagreb away and so on. So the Germans hang on every post next to the railroad for 5 kilometers one partisan, somebody they caught. So if you took the railroad for 5 kilometers, every post you passed, you saw somebody hanging.
When we lived in Shanghai, things were just desperately bad and poor. And there are beggars on the street, and then my older brother Gene and I would walk to school every day, 3 blocks to school, so we would watch everything. Later on, I told my father, years later, he couldn't believe it, because this was not the China he remembered. We lived there during the Second World War, during Japanese occupation, so he just couldn't believe it that it was happening, but yet, you know, this kind of horrible things were happening. And was it horrifying to me? Actually, it really wasn't.
Then when the Nazis came, I saw somewhat distressed. That was one of the distressing things. There was a girl which was in a class 1 higher, and I saw her on the street with a yellow star.
You remember?
And I tried to go on she was on the other side of the street and so on. I tried to go over to, you know, say hello or something to her, but she looked away and quickly kind of walked away. That was the last time I saw her and so on. And so very soon, you know, my family withdrew from anything political possible. We couldn't be completely free of it, because being a prominent family, we would have people, the government people coming, stay in Radin. We had to host them and so on. The German Minister of Interior went through all those regions here in an inspection and so on. And he also stopped in Radensee, and we had to keep him and his entourage, and we had to have a dinner for him and his staff and the people with him and so on. And during the dinner, the Minister of Interior asked my mother about how the feeling of the local population is, and my mother very honestly told him about the expulsion, the hostility which was created and so forth. Next day, my mother was arrested. She was arrested because the governor heard her remarks and was incensed that she is saying something critical about the region where he was a governor and so on. Fortunately, my mother had a friend from school who had some political influence and who on the third day was able to get her out of prison and so on. And this friend told her, next time keep your mouth shut, because if you would have been transferred into a camp, you would have been lost.
Thinking back, I'm amazed how unafraid we were, because the population, we're all in the same boat. You know, it's not you're in a worse situation than your neighbor. We were all confronted by the same situation, and we lived not too far from a hospital. And a lot of times you would see injured people, you know, bloody people been carried to the hospital. And then you would, the American planes would come, and you could hear the heavy B-12 or the humming, and then the alarm would go off, and then you always hide somewhere. At nighttime, you're supposed to block all the lights and such. So things were bad, but on the other hand, because you were there every day, you sort of lived with it. And was I shocked? Was I more upset? No, I didn't have the space to be away from it, looking from the outside, like my father was so upset he couldn't accept it, you know. So, but that's the way things were.
After a while you got a feeling how far away the bombs are falling, you know, by the noise and vibration and so on. When it was a distance away, you relaxed. Oh, they're not coming towards us. On the other hand, it was when it was coming closer, you know, you certainly got worried. We had to go down at night time when they were bombing down in the cellars and so on. And when you come out, you know, some of the houses were destroyed. And, you know, everybody had a little suitcase where you had in your most important papers, money, one set of things to change and so on, in case a bomb fell on the top of your house and destroyed your house.
The story was that the communists were not friendly toward educated people or people with money, land, the landlords, because the communists were fighting for the common people, the workers and the peasants. And since we were not the people with money, but we were educated, so there were great fears. Even though Mao Zedong himself was an educated person, but he really was fighting for the underclass. So that was the reason why we left. It wasn't just a sense, it was the reality. And then, you know, I always say I've been a refugee since I was 17, 18 months old. First we ran away from the Japanese, and then we ran away from the communists, and then more or less as refugees we came to America. And my parents really thought they'll be able to go home in 3 years. And that was in 1948.
Before moving to Bavaria from Vienna, I was recruited, and all the school kids were recruited and so on, to dig trenches against the Russians outside of Vienna and so on. And then from time to time, British Lightning airplanes would come and strive us and so on, shooting down at us and so on. It was not a big deal, you just lie flat and wait till they are passing. During the bombing, certainly a number of times bombs fell fairly close by, but not directly on the house where we lived and so on. So my parents, with some connections, tried to get him as a medic to the Air Force. For a short while it worked, but then towards the end of the war in 1945, everybody was kind of put into the infantry, and he was close to Poznan, the old Poznan in Poland. There was a very big battle between the Germans and the Russians and so on. He was one of the prisoners of war, and in the camp many people died on typhoid, and he was one of them.
Well, it was not easy, mainly because we didn't speak English. And when we first came to Blacksburg, it was somewhat of a shock. Altogether, there were 1,700 people in town, and a few thousand students on the campus. And the whole town was appear as if it has no people. You could walk for 5 minutes and not see a single person. And we moved from large cities, from Shanghai, from Sochi, and you've been to China. It's always crowded with people. That was, I think, and this was in fall, in October. Leaves were down, you see few branches and no people, and it gave me feeling of being lonely. I was lonely anyhow. So that was the first impression. And then we came over a weekend and started school on Monday. And of course, if you don't speak the language at 12, it couldn't have been easy.
Later on, my stepfather helped the partisans he was a physician, and he helped them with medical supplies and various other kind of supplies they needed and so on. The reason why he was really caught by Nazis was he was betrayed by some of their own people. He had a fair amount of gold, which he hid with help of some people, so that after the war it would be available. And there were some of the people who knew about it and who later on stole the gold, actually notified the Germans. The Gestapo arrested him in 1945, and he was executed in Maribor.
And then the classroom gets rowdy, which was frightening to me. So it was a matter of adjustment. learning the language.
Why was that frightening?
Well, if you're not used to all that noise and people jumping on table, and it was something totally foreign to me. Things were orderly. Communists might have been coming, they were at a distance. My life was orderly. If you go in the classroom, the desks were lined up, chairs were lined up, you take your seat, come in, and when expected you might raise your hand, but there was none of this. It took me a long time to learn, and of course it impacted upon my social life. If you can't talk to people, it was hard. And I'm sure I have told you, when I first came, the first IQ test I took, I had an IQ of 83, and
she was really kind of almost obsessively kind of searching for him. Only when the definite news came that he died and where he died and so on, she somehow, it calmed her down. It was a kind of a finish, a closure. She traveled to Poland, she put down kind of a wreath in the place where the soldiers were buried and so on. So it was for her an end, but till this moment she was always kind of haunted by the idea maybe he is still somewhere.
today I'm scared, maybe tomorrow I'll be less scared. Or, you know, and we studied so hard, but we didn't think of anything different. When you go to school, you study. We studied in China too. Here, we needed to study more because we needed to study more. We knew we were going to stay a while. It was my job to adjust. It wasn't their job to understand me or, you know, be more like me.
But in a way, you never adjust. You stayed. You kept your values.
We had a neighbor who stayed in Radheim. They were a very nice, apolitical, quiet family and so on, you know, and because the communists wanted to nationalize their property, they killed the family, you know, that was quite common.
There was one extra kind of a pressure. When we grew up in Blacksburg, we were the only Chinese family. So the other idea put in our heads is, we're the only Chinese here. Whatever you do, you're representing the Chinese. So not only we tried to be good students, we had to behave. I knew I was doing things differently, but I was not willing to change. Consciously, I didn't.
When I left Austria the first year in Canada, I was sometimes a bit homesick for home. My English was very poor, and it took a while to get adjusted and so on. And I did have almost visual flashback of certain kind of streets in Graz where I grew up, or other places and so on. You know, suddenly you remember something and you visually see one of these old Baroque the streets with the beautiful old Baroque buildings and so on. So things which are kind of close to your heart in some way.
So in many ways, I suppose we still haven't adjusted entirely. Maybe it'll take generations.
Well, I met her at a party, and it was, Ivan was attractive, she was interesting. We were talking about areas of mutual interest, and very soon I had the feeling that this somebody with whom I could kind of interact or, date.
He's a kind person, gentle, kind, learned, and good looking.
That's most important.
The United States is probably the most open and most predictable country where people from different cultures and different backgrounds can become well settled.
Opa and I were going down to Christiansburg to get
Marriage license.
marriage license. When we got there, the clerk said, "I'm so sorry, but I can't give it to you because of the miscegenation law. We couldn't get married in Virginia because we're a different race." And quite obviously, it was quite a shock and very upsetting. Everything was planned, and so we had to quickly look for a church in Maryland. Luckily, Maryland permitted marriage between Chinese and local people. Let's see how our marriage worked out. If it didn't work out, maybe the law was right. Maybe we shouldn't have gotten married. Or if our children turn out badly, then maybe there were real reasons why the laws existed. Now it's been 53 years.